in the Makabadan. Compatibility is that of government.
And there's you to help connect the dots from the top to the bottom. Join Rotimi Sankore and Arogo Obo at the public square every Friday from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. 99.3 Nigeria Info.
All right, it is 10 minutes past the hour for hot and humid day in the city of Lagos. I am Aogo Obo, and you're welcome to the Public Square on 99.3 Nigeria Info, where we discuss all the big and significant political issues in Nigeria. And today, Public Square, we're going to be looking at 10 years of the Boko Haram menace. We have Rotimi Sankore and I, guests from the BBC who've worked on stories of Boko Haram. I'm going to introduce you to them very shortly, but I'll tell you briefly about our handles where the comments or questions can come through at Public Square NG, at Rotimi Sankore, at Nigeria Info FM. Follow us on all these handles and tell us if you got questions or comments. Our WhatsApp number is 0809 597 5805. There's no idea segment today, Iobe. Is away, but will be join us.
She'll be back soon.
All right, Rotimi. Good afternoon.
Okay, thanks, Ahor. Well, 10 years this week of Boko Haram, and our colleagues at the BBC have done this wonderful documentary, 10 Years of Terror. Explained. Welcome, Naomi, and Manuela.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Okay, this is really important because the timeline of the documentary is quite interesting. It chronicles, it highlights things that many people either don't know or won't believe. And I'll come to those later. But the two things most people know is that over 30,000 people have been killed, absolute tragedy. Over 2 million displaced, very sadly, another tragedy. But when you started the documentary, you chose to start it from Mohammed Yusuf. Why did you choose to start there?
Right, so I think initially the idea was to look at the moment when Boko Haram shifted to become a violent insurgency. So the moment where Boko Haram, as we know it today, started existing. I think when most Nigerians and people abroad think of Boko Haram, they obviously think of kidnapping, the Chibok girls, they think of suicide bombings, the use of children. And we really wanted to chronicle how those violent practices started. And many commentators, historians, analysts who studied Boko Haram really felt that that started in 2009 when the then founder and leader of Boko Haram, Mohammed Yusuf, was killed in police custody. The situation in Maiduguri in the months leading up to his killing on the 30th of July was pretty tense. A new police force had been set up by the then governor of the Borno state to crack down on what they saw as illegal activities by Okada drivers, motorbike taxi drivers. And the members of Boko Haram, who many of them rode motorbikes, felt particularly targeted. And according to several historians, many of them were one day heading to a funeral to mark the death of 4 of their peers in a motorbike accident when they were harassed by police. That led them to start a series of violent actions, attacking police forces, attacking police stations, that then led the police to arrest Mohammed Yusuf, and a few days later he was dead.
And before he was killed, he had an unusual following compared to, or different to today's Boko Haram, because your documentary explains that the following of Boko Haram at the time was mixed. They had like ordinary people, educated people.
Yeah, I think the perception is that Boko Haram came from a place of poverty. That was also our perception before we started doing the research. But actually what we found out is that Mohammed Yusuf's followers at the time were a mix of people. They were mostly young. They were mostly people that believed in the ideology that he was preaching, that the Nigerian state was corrupt and un-Islamic, ineffective, and that the only way of kind of getting to a state that was closer to the pure version of Islam was to let go of that state and let go of any Western influence. And that's where that name Boko Haram comes from.
But he was invited to speak on university campuses.
Yeah. So he had university students
a
following
bit of
him.
a contradiction there.
Yeah. So his thoughts are a little bit we in the radio version of our piece we included an interview that is believed to be the only interview he gave an international broadcaster. He gave it to our colleagues at BBC Hausa in 2009, and there he lays out some of his ideas. For example, he didn't believe that the world was round. He didn't believe in evolution theory. So he had some pretty unorthodox beliefs. But he had many young people, as you say, people at universities, middle class people, wealthier people who believed in him and believed this idea in creating a purely Islamic state, and that's why they followed him.
And he pursued this essentially through preaching, speaking at rallies. Perhaps they'd been violent before then, I'm not sure, but violence was not their main tool.
No. Initially, it was all about the ideology.
Yeah, and he had his own school, his own complex where both adults and children were taught. So it was a very different Boko Haram to what we now think of today when we think of the group.
And the compound was attacked at some point.
Yeah, it was completely razed to the ground. In those clashes with the police, they didn't want any remnants of kind of where he had taught, where it had all started.
So the school, the mosque, the living quarters, everything was razed to the ground.
Yeah.
Okay, and as happens with many of these kind of groups globally, when the sort of more articulate, less violent leader arrested, killed, the young Turks kind of spring up. And in this case, it was first Abubakar Shekau. So what did you find shaped him initially?
So Abubakar Shekau was known, Mohammed Yusuf, from what of our research revealed, was a charismatic speaker, inclined to, the finer things in life. Apparently he had a nice car, and he was very well politically connected to some politicians in Borno at the time. Abubakar Shekau was a bit more radical. He was often described as, wearing kind of raggedy clothes. His appearance was unkempt. He didn't really care for flashy things.
Less sophisticated.
And he is the person, he's the face that most people probably associate the most with Boko Haram, because we've seen pictures and videos of him kind of yelling at the camera, pointing his finger. And he, in the aftermath of Mohammed Yusuf dying, a year later, a video surfaced of him, or a statement surfaced by him, claiming that he was now the leader of Boko Haram. He used to be one of Yusuf's lieutenants, and then he took over as the head of the organization.
And then they announced themselves on the global stage.
Yeah.
The attack on the UN compound.
Yeah, 2011, they attacked the UN compound, which is probably the first time most people outside of Nigeria had heard of them. Although, to be fair, many Nigerian journalists had covered Boko Haram extensively before that attack, and were aware of previous attacks that they'd carried out in Borno. But I think the time when it kind of came onto people's radar was that 2011 attack on the UN.
And that was quite deliberate.
Yeah.
Going after the UN compound to demonstrate that they had, at least from their own point of view, big ambitions.
Yeah, the capability. I mean, Shekau was very radical. He wanted to annihilate any kind of Western influence. He wanted to kind of conquer territory. He wanted to show up the Nigerian government. So attacking something like the UN, which is an internationally recognized body, the majority of casualties were UN members of staff. It sent a strong statement.
And then Shekau decided to exploit this thing known globally as ungoverned spaces to advance and capture territory. I mean, mostly where there was little presence of government, but from time to time they ran into police posts and military posts, and they took over quite a few local governments.
So during our film, we chose to kind of focus on 2013 to 2015, which is when they kind of claimed the most lives. Manuela did a graphic kind of showing how many lives were claimed in just those 2 years. I think it was about 11,000.
Yeah.
Which is a big chunk of the number
In
of
just
people
2
in
years.
just 2 years. And they've been around for 10, and as you said, official figures say 30,000. Many believe that it might actually be even much higher than that. So they killed 11,000 between those 2 years, and during those 2 years they conquered a lot of territory. That was also the time when they kidnapped the Chibok girls in 2014. So that's when really their name became, mainstream.
Okay. Worth reminding everyone that over 100 of Chibok girls are yet to be rescued. Quite sadly. Okay. The drama around Gwoza, their self-proclaimed capital. What was the impact when Boko Haram lost Gwoza? What was the impact on their territorial ambition?
So the current Nigerian government has said many times that Boko Haram is technically defeated. It's something that people, laugh, often scoff at, because they're still able to carry out terrorist attacks, definitely. But it is true that one of the things that they were able to achieve from 2015 onwards was recover territory from Boko Haram. And Gwoza was one of the bits of territory that they were able to take over from Borno. There used to be large tracts of Borno that were only governed by them, and gradually from 2015 onwards, government forces were able to retake them, and they managed to push Boko Haram to more isolated areas like Sambisa Forest and Lake Chad. So the moment when Gwoza was lost to Boko Haram, I think many people, for the first time in a long time, felt like they were less in control of the narrative, and perhaps the government stood a chance of actually defeating them.
But just jumping forward, if you don't mind, just in terms of chronology. So now there are two factions of Boko Haram, and one of them is still carrying on like they are trying to form a state. Which one of them? First, what are the two factions, and which one is still trying to form a state?
Well, the group split after Islamic State did not recognize Shekau, and instead recognized a group that's calling itself the Islamic State in West Africa province. Shekau's faction is now returned to its original name, the short version of which is JAS. And Islamic State in West Africa province, it has shifted tactics and has an area around Lake Chad where people are paying taxes. There are reports of Islamic State in West Africa province offering even business loans to the local people and winning over support. And that's
working with people in fishing and farming.
Exactly, and in some ways offering opportunities that haven't been there, and that's quite a marked shift.
And you describe that as some kind of heart and mind strategy.
Absolutely.
Did you find that it's effective in any way? It's giving them some kind of legitimacy?
We haven't been to the Lake Chad area ourselves, so we're having to rely on reports from people who've NGOs who've worked with people on the ground, analysts who've been there themselves, and from what they tell us, Boko Haram's strategy is working in that people will not give away information about them to the authorities. They might not wholly support everything that they do, but these are areas that have traditionally been marginalized, traditionally been excluded, traditionally not had access to basic goods. So suddenly you have people coming in, providing, as Naomi was saying, loans, providing financial support, logistical support with farming and fishing. That is, a level of service that they haven't got before. So it's unclear how successful the heart and mind strategy is in Lake Chad. We don't necessarily, having not been ourselves, we can't say that a majority of the population supports Boko Haram.
But this is what research and
But this
sources.
is what research is showing that they, they have a hold on the population, and that's the difference between them and how Shekau used to, and before him, Mohammed Yusuf used to operate. They talked about having territory but this new ISWAP actually has territory that they control. And that allows them to give themselves the legitimacy of calling themselves the Islamic State.
So based on this, how big is the distinction between the two factions?
Well, roughly, people tend to say that Ajay Shekau's faction has a tendency to still attack civilians indiscriminately, abduct them, and use child bombers. Whereas Islamic State West Africa is seen as being a little bit more strategic in the way it employs violence. I'm sure your listeners are aware of, attacks on military barracks recently, attacks on government posts, and those tend to be carried out by members of Islamic State West Africa. So they're framing themselves as attacking more government forces than civilians. But, they're still involved in the kidnapping of civilians. Many people think they might be behind the recent kidnapping of Action Against Hunger workers in the Northeast. So they're not an entirely benevolent force by any means, but that's how they're framing the dialogue. They're there against the government, and then they tell local people, we're here to support you instead.
And the Islamic State West Africa province is said to be the larger group now, with much larger numbers of fighters than the remaining faction run by Shekau.
Is it significant that the leader of the Islamic State faction is said to be the son of the founder of Boko Haram?
Well, it's a good story. I mean, it as everything in that part of the country is quite difficult to verify, but everybody believes that, yes, the leader of Islamic State West Africa province, who's called Al-Banawi, is the son of Mohammed Yusuf. And I think the fact that he has a connection to the original founder who started all of this makes him a very powerful figurehead. But, he's incredibly elusive. Even images, unlike Shekau, even images of him were hard to find, verified images. A few people have published stuff online claiming that it's him.
Could this be some kind of urban myth, in quotes?
You never know. Jihadism, not just in West Africa, but around the world, thrives on creating myths, thrives on creating mythology, thrives on creating heroes and good stories. That's how they radicalize people. And so Al-Banawi might just be another good story, but it's, many people believe that there is this link between himself and Muhammad.
And how does this affect the government's strategy in dealing with Boko Haram when you have two factions with slightly different strategies?
Well, as far as when we've insofar as the government is concerned, I don't believe I've seen any recognition of the split. So they still refer to both groups as Boko Haram, as one and the same.
And we haven't seen any evidence of shifting tactics in terms of dealing with them. There's still this line that they've been defeated.
One of the president's spokesmen said this week that the Boko Haram that they knew, I'm not sure what he means by they knew, but he said the Boko Haram that they knew has been degraded and defeated, and that the Boko Haram you have now is another kind of Boko Haram. But he didn't say there are two factions, this is how they are going to deal with them. Do you think there's, do you think that recognizes the shifts?
I mean, not explicitly. Seems like semantics to me. But I think it's at least an acknowledgement of the fact that the group has changed. That's what we kind of wanted to show. Most people we spoke to believe that the transformation of Boko Haram in the last 10 years has been kind of one of the most rapid shifts that we've seen, from kind of a small local group of kind of, as you say, a mixed background, people of mixed backgrounds, to this insurgency group that's affiliated itself with one of the biggest terror groups in the world. And is now controlling, territory in northeastern Nigeria. It's been a kind of rapid progression. So some acknowledgement on the part of the government that there's been a change is good. It shows that they're aware of the fact that they're not dealing with the same enemy as before. I guess what most Nigerians would like to know is what that means in practice for the fight against this terror group. Does that mean there's going to be any change? Are they going to be focusing their efforts on the Lake Chad area? Are they trying to gather intelligence from civilians who fled that area?
Is it mainly a military battle?
Exactly. Or are they trying to use, de-radicalization programs? What do those include? It's all very murky and unclear, and we understand that there are security concerns on their part. They don't want to let their strategy out for jihadis to hear, but I think there's also a lot of distrust from the part of the public who wants to find out how they plan to deal with this.
Okay, let's come to Manuela. How difficult was it? I mean, I've seen your illustrations and animation and design. How difficult was it bringing to life a 10-year-old story and using animation to illustrate, including the data and figures and things used, which many people either don't know, don't recall, or don't understand? How difficult was it for you to go there?
I think it was a good challenge. I'm always up for a challenge, and this is a story that I think is important for people to know about, especially the young audience, many of whom, when this first started, they were very young, and so they don't really know a lot of how it started. So it was a fun challenge, and we set about to do first and foremost a digital video. So we tried to make it appeal to young audience, and then we involved different formats, using graphics, illustration, footage. We didn't want to sacrifice anything, so we figured whatever format could tell that part of the story best, would use it. So that's why it combines a whole bunch of different things into it. But I
real
think
life
it
footage,
exactly, with
some
animation, graphics, even like Miami Envision. So we combined it that way and used music and everything to make it appeal to people, so they would actually watch it and understand everything that was in the video.
Some of the graphics remind me of this painting, The Scream. Any inspiration from there?
Actually, no.
Listeners, just Google is your friend. Look up The Scream. Just say painting The Scream, and then watch.
Was it her expression? One of the girls.
Yes. Yes.
I was actually for that scene. I tried to think of the different emotions the girls must have felt that night. So one of them is actually looks really angry. Then those two in front look very confused and frightened, because they must have been so frightened. I went to a boarding school, so I can only imagine how that must have felt in the middle of the night, that kind of thing, So that's what I tried to depict.
Okay. We have to take a short break for ads, and then we'll come back to the documentary. Please stay tuned. We'll be back in 2 or 3 minutes.
More talk, news, and sports after this.
24 hours in a day. 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That's a lot of time. We fill it with the best in talk. From the morning crossfire to the money, business, and economy show, down to the midday dialogue, the lunchtime magazine, hard facts, and so much more. Just for your listening pleasure. Your number one news, talk, and sports station. The station for everybody.
Everybody in Nigeria listens to Nigeria Info.
All right, welcome back.
I was going to say I like that bit. Everyone in Nigeria is listening to Nigeria Info.
Yeah.
That's one of our colors.
And by the way, you can also watch this live. We're on Facebook as well as Twitter. If you've got comments for this great BBC team here, Naomi, Manuela, and Mayeni, who have been talking with us for the last half an hour about 10 years of Boko Haram. Talk to us on Public Square. Handle again at Public Square NG, at Nigeria Info FM, at Rotimi Sankore, at Aogo Obo. Let's talk some more. But back to you, Rotimi.
Okay. Thanks so much, Aho. Okay. Two big things I'd like to clarify. I know you have to go soon. One is on the use of female suicide bombers. I mean, some people look at this not so much as suicide in a deliberate way, but the abuse is described more as the abuse of young girls especially. Which one of the factions seems to do this more?
So that is a practice that's been used more by Abubakar Shakal's faction, JAS. And one of the reasons why many analysts believe that they use that tactic is twofold. First of all, girls are less likely to be searched by security forces. They're more likely to go unnoticed. But there's also a different element to it.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of psychological warfare and the idea of terrorism, the message of using young children as a weapon is incredibly powerful. So it's the propaganda element to using young children, young girls as well.
And I mean, you see it time and again in, I'm from Sierra Leone, so we had a decade-long civil war, and there also young people were used as weapons of war, were used as child soldiers. They were quick to radicalize. If you sever ties with their homes by forcing them to kill their own relatives, they remained loyal to you because they were too ashamed to go back home from what they'd done. And they were often more willing to take risks than many adults. So it's not a strategy that's original to Boko Haram necessarily. Something that time and time again, unfortunately, you see in
different terrorist groups, militias have grabbed kids because they're a more efficient tool.
Exactly.
Once they are brainwashed.
Exactly. They're easier to brainwash, and then once you've got them for life.
And if the other faction, ISWAP, is not doing this, it's because they think it's...
I think it's part of a wider strategy that ISWAP and IS had. I mean, what terrorized people about IS, the so-called Islamic State, when it was spreading in the Middle East, where you were having loads of these young people come over from the West. From Europe. Joining IS. And I think the way that they won those young people to their mind, I mean, the jury's out on that, but the interviews we've got from people that have left is that they were seduced by the ideology. They were seduced by the idea of an alternative society to what Western society was offering them, an alternative to capitalism, an alternative to secularism, somewhere where they could feel that they belonged. And so I think IS has always been very good at using strategy, so not using child bombers, avoiding targeting civilians, are all ways of pointing themselves as an alternative space, a slightly,
in other words,
more ethical space.
Claiming to have some kind of ethics.
But it's all strategy.
If that can be described, I mean, if a terrorist group can be described as having ethics.
Yeah, it's just strategy to lure people in. And the reality is, a lot of the time, once those young people joined IS, they describe, seeing scenes of horror, particularly young women being treated appallingly, being violated. So there is still a lot of destruction and horror happening within IS's camp. They're just a lot more strategic in how they apply that violence.
It's kept inside the community.
Exactly.
So you only see it when you join or arrive. They don't use it as a tool that is picked up by the media.
And that's why they've been particularly effective amongst younger people.
And part of this, I suppose, is that IS also positions themselves, not just by use of their name, but by their strategy as kind of building a new community or society for people that don't want what is described as the corrupt Western. And this faction that they have here, do they do that? Do they have some kind of pseudo-judicial system? Do they?
Yeah, so in our research we found out that it sets up their own courts where they apply Sharia law. So that's one of the ways in which they administer justice separate from the state. And as we said before, those are areas that are so remote anyway, that very few people already were used to using traditional ways of traditional legal paths when they wanted to resolve disputes. So now they've set up a court system that is, more structured to kind of allow them to become.
How does this happen? Is this because the absence of the Nigerian, Cameroonian, or Chadian states?
Yeah, these are very remote areas. They've been isolated. So Lake Chad is, formed. There's loads of islands around Lake Chad. They've always been difficult to reach. And there's not been much of a government presence there for years. So that's made it easier for IS to swoop in and provide those services that weren't there before.
I think there's a real vacuum in terms of services, in terms of opportunity. And ISWAP see that as their own opportunity to win support and create their own Islamic State. But I think it's important to note that whilst ISWAP are affiliated to Islamic State in the Middle East, it's not clear how far those ties actually go. And whilst in terms of propaganda videos, that link has been made and they are affiliated, ISWAP still has a very different history and is still a very different entity.
So the name is more like some kind of franchising?
Yes, some kind of franchises, they're tied in some way. But there's been fears, I think, that perhaps fighters, now that the so-called Islamic State has lost territory in the Middle East, I think there was a fear that fighters might have been coming from that caliphate to West Africa to try and apply some of the lessons learned there here. So far, we haven't seen any evidence of foreign fighters infiltrating the Nigerian state yet. So I think those fears are overblown. They are connected to the Islamic State in some way, but we're not really sure that there's that direct link between them in terms of sharing intelligence, sharing fighters, sharing tactics.
So the collapse of Lake Chad has had real devastating impacts on the northeast. In terms of rebuilding, one of the big challenges that the Nigerian, Chadian, and Cameroonian states face is the majority of people, the majority of men, even Nigeria's own National Bureau of Statistics data from many years ago shows that, for instance, in places like Yobe, at the height of the insurgency, 83% of all men had not had access to education. In Borno, it was 63%. In addition to that, Boko Haram then went on a rampage, destroying more than 1,000 schools, as if to emphasize that education was not welcome. How much does the rebuilding of schools and communities and the normalization, how much does that affect the strategic balance between rebuilding those places and Boko Haram's ability to maintain its power there?
I mean, there's a struggle that the government is facing right now. So many analysts believe that the current strategy, which is just a purely military strategy, is not necessarily a good one. There are a few de-radicalization programs, but as I said earlier, they're opaque. It's unclear how a person is selected to be part of the program. It's unclear which process they go through during the program, and then when they come out, local communities are skeptical that these are people that have been fully rehabilitated yet. So there is definitely a cry out there by many security analysts, many commentators, for more than a military approach. Maybe, as you say, the rebuilding of schools, obviously the security situation on the ground needs to be considered, but there needs to be something more than just going out there, fighting them and then claiming that they've been defeated. You actually need to find a way to counter all the damage that they've done to people's way of thinking in the region, de-radicalize people who might be tempted to sympathize with them, who have already sympathized with them. There's also the much harder work, frankly, of just, trying to reverse all of that damage that they've had by being there for 10 years and, radicalizing people for 10 years and dominating communities for 10 years.
Because demographics play a big role, because if you factor in, for instance, the high total fertility rates and the population growth outstripping investment in development, it seems that Boko Haram is playing a waiting game, that in some years' time the demographics will shift in their favor. Does that seem...
I think it's clear that a military strategy alone will not work. There needs to be a longer term approach that means that people will be won over by the Nigerian state that needs to win these people back.
So much more investment in social and human development,
and also countering this belief
to back the military.
Yeah, and countering this belief that the military is corrupt. Frankly, we've spoken to local villagers who are like, I get shaken down by the military all the time. Those narratives, checkpoints and being asked for bribes, those kind of narratives need to be reversed. If you're trying to counter somebody who's telling you that Nigerian state is not for you, we're for you, you need to show them that you're for you, that you're not what they say you are. And so I think, so many things need to be done. More investment in the military. You have low morale within military troops, not enough rotation amongst them, allegations of, deaths that have gone unmarked amongst the military. So all of that investment, I think, needs to be put in so that the forces feel supported, so that they don't feel the need to take things like bribes, so that they get they get regular breaks away from the horror that they see every day. And so that some sort of relationship can be rebuilt between the armed forces and the local communities. Because as long as the local communities see them as enemies, they won't collaborate. They won't give them information on Boko Haram. And this cycle will just continue.
One last question in relation to abduction of large numbers of people, especially young girls. So the Chibok girls, well documented. Some escaped, some released. Over 100 still being held. Did your documentary unravel anything about this, I think, 112 girls, where they may be, what's happening? Any sense, any idea?
Well, I think whilst Chibok caught people's attention and a lot of international politicians spoke out, that's the moment that most people outside of Nigeria heard of Boko Haram for the first time. There have been, UNICEF say, 1,000 children that have been kidnapped by the group. It's unclear how many.
And this excludes the Dapchi girls.
No, that includes the Dapchi.
That includes the Dapchi girls.
That will include them. That's an overall figure for this period. But I think there's a lot of attention, quite rightly, on the Chibok girls, but they're part of a much larger group who seem to be still being held by Boko Haram.
And this 1,000 or so it's not from schools, for instance, so it doesn't have that dramatic effect.
No, there have been instances on other schools. Chibok, I think, caught people's attention because they were young women. The lack of media coverage in the few days immediately afterwards, once it got outside of the borders of Nigeria, it kind of coincided with social media activism becoming more prominent, and then a few right voices kind of came on board, and that's that gave it the boost that it needed.
And
But there had been
the
attacks on
hashtag
schools.
Bring Back Our Girls.
Yes, there had been reports of attacks, including in the international media, actually, of attacks on schools before Chibok girls. So it wasn't the first time that a school was attacked.
A month before that happened, remember Buniyadi?
The boys' school.
There was a boys' school that was attacked, and some really horrific descriptions of the treatment.
Yeah, I mean,
of
the
those
boys were seen more as rivals, so they weren't really abducted, they were just massacred.
They were slaughtered. So I think, because they were girls, they were trying to get an education in a part of the world where female literacy is still so low. As Naomi said, rightly so, they got the attention that they deserve. But it's a problem that's much bigger, much bigger than the Chibok girls.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mayeni, Naomi, and Manuela. I think your task was the most difficult, Manuela, trying to illustrate situations which must have been horrific to imagine.
Yeah, very horrific to imagine.
Did you have sleepless nights after?
I had sleepless nights working on the video.
You didn't wake up at night sweating?
Thankfully, no.
And I should say Manuela is part of a much bigger unit. So the BBC's bureau now has a whole digital hub full of young, talented people, young, talented Nigerians like Manuela, who create content specifically for online, for digital hub audiences all across West Africa. West Africa Digital Hub, which is based here in Lagos, but has created graphics during elections. Some of your listeners might have seen on the BBC website. As results were coming, we graphicized them by state. That was created by Manuela's team.
Yes.
Creating
Thank you.
interactive maps.
And I borrowed some of that during the coverage countdown 2019. I remember.
Yeah, I do. Fantastic.
So that's part of the BBC's
presentation.
investment in Nigeria to try and create more engaging content for young Nigerian audiences and
innovative.
In the diaspora as well. So it's our first time collaborating. We work in news. Usually we're not very good always at telling stories digitally. It's our first time collaborating with the Digital Hub, but we're really hoping to do more of that in the future.
Absolutely.
Okay, so it's our partners from the BBC. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
You can't rush. Can you do 5 minutes? Some people may have 1 or 2 questions.
Sure.
Please?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so...
Say no now.
Okay. All right. So, in case you don't have the numbers, there 012770993, 012771993, 012772993, and then 012773993. Call us. Let's hear what you think about 10 years of Boko Haram menace in Nigeria and how it's affected you, and in what ways has it shaped your perspectives.
Okay, so everyone has to be very brief. They can't stay long, so maybe we can take, 30, 40 seconds of each call. And even then, just very few calls. Hello?
Hello, good evening, sir.
Good evening. Welcome to the public square. Who's calling and from where?
Okay, my name is Michael. I call from Lekki.
Okay, Michael from Lekki. Okay, very quick, very brief. I have a quick question or quick comment.
Briefly, I would like to ask your panelists, would they assure Nigerians that they will internationalize their findings? Because I know that fighting terrorism is usually better when global community get involved. Because Nigeria alone, it will be difficult for them to defeat these people. So I will appeal to them to try and help escalate this problem we have in Nigeria through their means, please.
Okay. So they don't have to say a lot there. It's the BBC, so it's international already. Okay?
Okay, but they could do a lot to highlight and expand the scope of dissemination so that
that's what I'm explaining. It's the BBC. It's on the global stage BBC. Already. Yes.
Okay. All right. All right.
All
That's fine. So we locally here with all the different bodies, we should try as much as possible to also internationalize this problem, because the government has really tried, but it appears that it's not been easy for them.
Okay.
So I think international community, their assistance will be highly needed in this fight.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right, sir. Bye-bye. Okay.
Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the public square.
Oh, thank you very much. Rotimi, I appreciate the manner and the way you handle commentaries over Nigerian affairs. Please,
Thank you.
if you can, just check the Bible book of Luke, chapter 1, verse 25, and see that the Bible has written all you are trying to say or trying to put people's mind to for many years ago, and this is the fulfillment.
Okay.
You
haven't told us though who's calling and from where.
Okay, I'm Okosisi.
Okay.
Yes, my name is Okosisi.
Okay.
So if you check that scripture, you'll be able to help you so that you relax your mind in some certain actions, in a certain way you worry over the things that is happening. So I appreciate.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, folks, more of comments and thanks than hello?
Yeah, hello.
Okay. So this I think this will be our last call. Yeah, who's calling and from where? Welcome to the public square. Sorry?
My name is I Square Okori from Ojo.
Okay, I Square Okori from Ojo. Welcome to the public square. Question, comment for our friends from the BBC?
I think I must commend you, especially Sankore, for good job you are doing.
Thank you.
You are doing a good job for us. Please.
Okay, thank you. But I didn't make the film. Our colleagues made the film.
I think the issue of terrorism has affected us badly, especially the economy, because it has depleted our financial pockets. And I think it will be solved, the international community should help us to solve it. Because it is not that we cannot do it, but due to political or this lack of will. So I think through international assistance that we can get rid of free from this terrorism. I think it's time to do it just now, please.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. So if you are still trying to call, we can take the calls after the ads at 5. The public square is still with you. But we'd like to thank everyone again. Manuela, Naomi, Mayeni, thank you so much. Great documentary helping to chronicle what really happened, so there is no gap in historical memory.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. And for people watching on Facebook, a number of comments coming in. I just pick out one. Someone knows Manuela Bonomi is your surname, right?
Yes.
It says Abdul Malik Fad. Thank you for such amazing visuals. Watching here in Lagos, a number of people watching and thoroughly enjoying the show. All right, so we'll take a quick break, the news, and then Public Square will continue where we can engage with you some more. And thank you very much to the BBC.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you again.
Bye.
More news and information coming up. We'll be back in a moment.